in front of hundreds of investors, journalists, and international partners, built by CEO Sebastian Carter, suddenly died on stage. The enormous display screen froze. The live stream cameras kept rolling. Company stock threatened to collapse within minutes. Every senior engineer on the floor scrambled in helpless panic. Then a man in a worn maintenance uniform stepped out from backstage. His name was Ryan Miller, a struggling single father who drove an old hybrid everyone mocked. That battered car sat in the parking lot like a joke nobody wanted to hear, but it held the secret that saved everything. If you've ever believed that the people most overlooked often matter the most, you're going to want to hear this story. The morning of the ND1 launch arrived like a countdown clock nobody could stop. Sebastian Carter pulled into the Novadrive campus at 6:45, 2 hours before his senior team, because that was simply how he operated. He was 34 years old and had rebuilt Novadrive from a struggling mid-tier automotive supplier into one of the most talked-about electric vehicle companies in the country. His father, Gerald Carter, had founded the company and poured 30 years into its bones, and when Gerald died unexpectedly 3 years earlier, Sebastian had inherited both the company and the weight of living up to something enormous. The ND1 was not just a product launch, it was a declaration that the son was equal to the father, that the company's future was as bright as its past. Sebastian wore a charcoal suit without a tie, his jaw set, his posture the kind that comes not from arrogance but from years of training himself not to show fear in rooms full of people waiting for him to flinch. He walked through the main demonstration bay, a high-ceiling space of polished concrete and glass now flanked by projection screens 3 stories tall, touching nothing, cataloging everything, trusting his team completely. Amelia Brooks arrived at 7:15 with a tablet full of real-time analytics and a coffee she hadn't touched yet. She ran communications for Novadrive with the kind of precision that media companies hired consultants to imitate. Every press seat was confirmed, every camera angle had been mapped, and the live stream platform was already showing a pre-show countdown that had drawn 140,000 viewers before 8 in the morning. Amelia knew what this day meant beyond the technical specs. If ND1 performed as advertised, Novadrive would lock in 3 major fleet contracts and likely trigger a significant stock movement by end of trading. She had written the press release for both scenarios, success and failure, because that was her job, and she had learned long ago that the version you hope never to send is the one you must write first. She stood at the edge of the stage reviewing the livestream feed on her tablet and felt the particular quality of silence that precedes something irreversible. Jackson Reed arrived with the confidence of a man who believed the room already belonged to him. He was 47, a decade older than Sebastian, and had served as Novadrive's chief operating officer since Gerald Carter's time. He had expected, when Gerald died, that the board would recognize his institutional knowledge and hand him the company. Instead, they had promoted Sebastian young, polished, press-friendly Sebastian, and Jackson had spent 36 months convincing himself he was fine with that. He was not fine with that. He walked the floor with a practiced smile, greeting journalists by name, clasping shoulders, projecting the warm authority of a man in total command. When he passed the main entrance and saw the crowds gathering outside, something tightened in his chest that had nothing to do with excitement. Ryan Miller turned into the Novadrive parking lot at 7:50 in a 12-year-old hybrid that announced its arrival with a sound like a patient clearing its throat. He was 39, medium height, with the kind of quiet face that people forgot in a crowd and remembered only later, usually when they realized he had been the one who fixed something important. He had been hired by Novadrive's facilities contractor 3 weeks earlier for temporary maintenance work, systems checks, cable routing, load balancing verification in auxiliary spaces. Before he went inside, he pulled out his phone and called his daughter. Ella Miller answered on the second ring, already dressed for school, her voice carrying the slightly theatrical brightness of an 8-year-old who had decided to be in a good mood. She asked if the big car company people were nervous, and Ryan told her they were, a little. She said that was okay because he could fix anything, including nervousness, and that she needed him at her school recital by 6. Ryan promised. He meant it with the full weight of a man who had learned that promises to small people were the most important kind. He ended the call, pocketed the phone, and walked through the service entrance carrying a canvas tool bag that had seen better decades. Jackson Reed watched Ryan cross the lot from a second-floor window. He noted the car. He noted the bag. He noted the name tag the facility's supervisor had printed, Ryan Miller, temp to maintenance, and felt the particular contempt of a man who has decided that certain people are simply furniture. He turned away from the window and sent a short message from his personal device. Then he pocketed it, composed his expression, and went to find Sebastian and smile at him and wish him a good launch. Ryan's assignment that morning was a secondary electrical panel on the north side of the staging area, a distribution board that fed auxiliary systems including the lighting grid, backup climate control, and the supplementary charging infrastructure that would keep the ND1's display systems live during the demonstration. He moved through the work methodically, checking breaker ratings, measuring impedance, running a load simulation from a handheld analyzer that was older than most of the people on the main floor, but accurate to within a fraction of a percent. While he worked, 3 younger engineers from the ND1 integration team passed through the corridor wearing NovaDrive branded quarter zips and talking in the easy shorthand of people who had recently graduated from institutions that had told them they were exceptional. One of them noticed the hybrid through the parking side window and said something about it loud enough to carry, called it a mechanical fossil. Another said it looked like it ran on optimism and leaking coolant. None of them looked at Ryan. He was, to them, part of the infrastructure, like the cable trays on the wall or the junction boxes overhead. Ryan didn't respond. He noted the readings on his analyzer and wrote them in a small spiral notebook. The truth was that he had heard variations of that comment for years and had stopped finding them painful. The hybrid had cost him $4,000 7 years ago, in the first hollow year after his wife passed, when every dollar had to account for itself 3 times over. He had maintained it himself and upgraded it himself, and in the process buying manuals instead of meals out, spending Saturday mornings under the hood while Ella sat on a folding chair reading to him. He had become something closer to an engineer than a mechanic. He had added a custom energy buffer to the hybrid's secondary electrical circuit, a hand-built unit using reclaimed capacitor banks and a programmable load controller he had designed himself over 6 months of evenings after Ella went to sleep. It gave the car an anomalous stability in its electrical output, a smoothness under variable load that newer vehicles didn't have because they didn't need it, except that sometimes, in specific conditions, they did. Ryan had grown up in a household that believed in fixing things. His father had been an electrician in Cincinnati, a quiet man who taught his son that the most dangerous assumption in any system was the assumption that someone else had already found the problem. Ryan had carried that lesson into an electrical engineering degree, then into a decade at a firm that did energy systems integration for industrial clients. He had been genuinely good at the work, and his career had been moving at the pace of someone who would one day run something. Then his wife got sick, and then she died, and then nothing about career pace seemed relevant anymore. He had taken the first small jobs he could find that left him home by 4 o'clock, telling himself it was temporary. 3 years later it still was, and he had stopped minding, because Ella was 8 and would only be 8 once. It was while running a second load simulation, something his own caution compelled him to do even though the scope of his work didn't require it, that Ryan's analyzer flagged an anomaly. The reading was subtle, a periodic voltage oscillation in the primary feed conduit, occurring at irregular intervals, with a waveform signature that didn't match normal grid noise. In a standard system it would have been benign. In a system feeding a vehicle with the ND1's level of integrated safety architecture, a vehicle whose battery management system was designed to lock down at the first sign of uncontrolled power variance, it was a potential trigger for a full protective shutdown. Ryan stared at the reading and then ran it again. The waveform reappeared. He found the lead facility supervisor, a harried man named Pete who was currently managing 12 tasks simultaneously. Ryan showed him the analyzer readings and explained what he thought they indicated. Pete looked at the screen, then at Ryan's name tag, then back at the screen. He said the primary electrical systems had been signed off by the senior electrical contractor and that Ryan should stick to his assigned panel and not create problems that didn't exist. Ryan wrote the time in his notebook, 8:22 in the morning. By 9 o'clock the main demonstration bay was standing room only. 17 international media organizations had cameras positioned on the tiered press platform. Representatives from 2 municipal fleet programs sat in the second row with their own engineers. The livestream counter had crossed 400,000 viewers and was climbing. Sebastian stood in the green room behind the stage, reading notes he had already read 3 times that morning. He was not nervous in the conventional sense. He was concentrated. He thought about Gerald Carter, who had built Novadrive on a conviction that the American automotive industry would eventually be forced to choose between reinvention and extinction, and that the companies who chose reinvention early would define what came after. Sebastian had inherited that conviction and sharpened it. The reinvention needed to be both technically impeccable and publicly legible. The ND1 was his proof of concept, and if that proof held today, Novadrive would enter a different tier of the industry entirely. Jackson came into the green room at 9:15, moving with practiced ease. He told Sebastian the room looked great, the energy was good, and that the team was ready. He then added, almost as an afterthought, that a few integration engineers had expressed concern about whether the communication stack between the vehicle's autonomy module and the stage control system had been adequately tested under full broadcast load. He framed it as something he had already addressed, something Sebastian didn't need to worry about. Sebastian heard it, noted it, filed it. He asked if there was a specific action item. Jackson said no. He had handled it, and Sebastian returned to his notes. Amelia had been watching Jackson for 3 days. It was not a formal observation, it was the kind of attention that develops in people who have built careers reading rooms. Jackson's behavior in the week before the launch had shifted in ways she couldn't yet name precisely, a fraction more animated with external contacts, a fraction more withdrawn in internal briefings, a quality of attentiveness that pointed slightly away from the work and toward the outcome. She didn't have anything concrete, only a feeling, which in her experience was often the precursor to something concrete. She had started keeping a mental log. Ryan had returned to his assigned panel but couldn't stop thinking about the oscillation reading. At 9:30 he walked back to the primary conduit junction and pressed his analyzer directly against the conduit housing. The waveform was still there, slightly stronger than before, now pulsing at intervals close enough to regular that Ryan's mind began building a different explanation, not electromagnetic interference, not grid noise, but something deliberate, something inserted. He stood in the corridor for a moment with that thought sitting uncomfortably in his chest. He was a temp employee. He had already been turned away once. There was a school recital at 6 and a daughter who needed him to keep this job. He stood there for 45 seconds, then picked up his tool bag and walked toward the stage entrance. He found Sebastian near the stage steps, surrounded by PR staff and a camera crew. Ryan approached the outer edge of the group and waited. When Sebastian's eye found him, Ryan stepped forward and said quietly and plainly that he had found an electrical anomaly in the primary feed and that it needed to be addressed before the vehicle powered up. Sebastian looked at him, at the maintenance tag, at the tool bag, at the calm in his face, and then a PR coordinator stepped between them and said they needed to keep the area clear. Sebastian said he'd have someone look into it. He was on stage in 11 minutes. Ryan wrote the time in his notebook, 9:38. The ND1 entered the demonstration bay at 10:02, rolling silently through the main bay doors on its own drive system, guided by stage automation software programmed to bring it to a precise stop at the center of a white circle 12 feet in diameter. It was a beautiful machine, low and wide, with a swept roofline and an exterior finish in a color Novadrive's design team had named Arctic Slate, a gray that photographs differently in every light. The 3 projection screens behind it came alive with synchronized imagery, infrastructure maps, energy efficiency data, safety ratings rendered in confident white type. The audience watched in the way audiences watch things they have already decided they want to like. Sebastian took the stage to sincere applause. He spoke for 4 minutes about the idea behind the ND1, about his father's belief that reinvention was the only honest response to a changing world, about the engineering team's 7 years of work, and about what it meant to bring the safest autonomous passenger vehicle ever tested on American roads to a room full of people about to see it perform. He was measured and genuine, and if he was performing certainty, he was doing it well enough that the certainty felt real. The ND1 sat behind him, its cabin illuminated from within, its sensors cycling in a visible sweep pattern across the stage. The live stream was approaching 900,000 viewers. Sebastian said, "Let's show you what it does." He lifted the stage control tablet and pressed the activation sequence. For 3.5 seconds, nothing went wrong. The ND1's drive system engaged smoothly. The vehicle advanced 4 feet toward the first marker exactly as programmed, and the cabin display lit up with the autonomy interface that the integration team had spent 2 months making beautiful. Then the vehicle stopped, not the smooth programmed stop of a system executing instructions, but a sudden, total halt, the kind of hard lock that battery management systems execute when they detect a condition they have been trained to treat as catastrophic. The cabin display went dark. The exterior light strip along the vehicle's lower edge cut to nothing. One projection screen flickered and went gray. Then the second did the same. The room had the specific silence that follows something going wrong in a place where nothing was supposed to go wrong. Sebastian stood on stage holding the tablet, looking at the vehicle, not moving. The silence lasted 4 seconds before the murmuring started. The press corps, the investors, the fleet representatives, all of them reaching simultaneously for devices, recalibrating what they were witnessing. Sebastian pressed the tablet sequence again. Nothing. He tried the manual override. Nothing. He lowered the tablet and stood with his hands at his sides, broadcasting the exact expression of a man who has just felt the floor shift. The senior integration engineers reached the vehicle in under 30 seconds and attempted a remote boot sequence from the technician's station. The battery management system had isolated itself completely, a condition requiring not a software restart but a full electrical discharge and controlled reinitialization, a process that took, under ideal conditions, approximately 25 minutes. The livestream counter crossed 1 million viewers. Amelia stood at the edge of the press platform watching the narrative form in real time into something she could not yet stop. Jackson Reed was at the back of the room, and the expression on his face, for just 3 seconds, was not the expression of a man watching a disaster. It was the expression of a man watching a plan. He rearranged his features into concern and moved forward through the crowd. Ryan had been watching from the side bay doorway that maintenance staff used to move between the staging area and the back corridors. He had watched the vehicle advance, and then he had watched it lock, and the waveform from his analyzer that morning came back to him with the clarity of something recognized. He understood immediately. The oscillation had crossed a threshold inside the vehicle's battery management architecture, triggering the protective isolation protocol. The vehicle had done exactly what it was designed to do. The problem was not the vehicle. The problem was in the feed, in the manufactured irregularity he had identified at 8:22 and at 9:38 and had been turned away from addressing twice. He stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at Sebastian Carter across the width of the room. Then he picked up his tool bag and walked onto the stage floor. One of the integration engineers moved to intercept him. Ryan showed the readings on his analyzer and said 3 sentences. The vehicle's battery management system was in protective isolation because of a voltage oscillation in the primary feed conduit. The oscillation had been present since at least 8 that morning, and he could stabilize the feed using equipment in his vehicle in the parking lot. The engineer looked at the analyzer screen, then at Ryan's maintenance tag, then at the screen again. Then he walked 3 steps to Sebastian Carter and said something in his ear. Sebastian turned and looked at Ryan Miller for the first time that morning with the full weight of his attention. The integration engineer delivered Ryan's message in a compressed murmur, professional enough to keep it from the nearest cameras. Sebastian listened without interrupting, his face entirely neutral, the way faces go when the mind is running faster than expression can follow. When the engineer finished, Sebastian looked at Ryan directly. Ryan did not look away. He was holding his analyzer in one hand and his tool bag in the other, and his posture communicated the specific calm of someone who has already decided that what they are about to say is true and is simply waiting for the room to understand that. Sebastian said, "Say it again." "What you need." Ryan said it plainly. He needed his hybrid brought to the technical bay behind the stage, access to the auxiliary power conduit junction, and 5 minutes with the ND1 secondary charging interface. He had a portable energy buffer in his vehicle, a custom-built load-balancing unit that could be coupled to the auxiliary feed and would eliminate the oscillation by absorbing irregular voltage spikes before they reached the vehicle's battery management threshold. It was not a permanent fix. It was a bridge, enough stability to allow the protective lock to disengage, enough clean power to run a controlled reinitialization, enough time to complete the demonstration. He had used the same unit to stabilize the power supply during a blackout at a regional medical clinic 2 winters ago, and it had held for 6 hours without a single fault. Jackson appeared at Sebastian's left shoulder. He had moved through the crowd with the ease of a man who knew where to position himself. He said, in a tone calibrated to sound reasonable, that using unlicensed equipment from a temporary employee in a live demonstration environment was not something NovaDrive's legal or safety frameworks permitted, and that if something went wrong with Ryan's device, it would expose the company to liability that would make the current situation look manageable. He said it efficiently and quietly, but not quietly enough to prevent Amelia from hearing. She was 3 feet away, tablet in hand. Watching Jackson's face, she noted that he had moved immediately to liability rather than solutions. She noted that his voice carried an urgency that exceeded the register of professional caution. She noted, for the third time in 3 days, that he was watching the outcome of this situation more than he was trying to change it. Sebastian asked Ryan a single direct question: had he worked with battery management systems of this architecture before? Ryan said he had spent 8 years on battery management systems for grid-scale energy storage projects before his career changed directions. He said the ND1 system was a third-generation derivative of an architecture he had helped certify for a utility client back in 2017. He said he would not have offered if he were not certain. Sebastian Carter was a man who ran a company built on data and verification, on models and projections and peer-reviewed specifications. He had spent his entire professional life ensuring that important decisions were supported by evidence he could point to. He was now being asked to trust a person instead of a document. He looked at Ryan Miller, at the steadiness in his eyes, at the analyzer displaying its readings, at the hands holding the tool bag with no tremor, and he nodded. Jackson started to speak again. Sebastian raised one hand, a simple gesture that meant stop, which Jackson, to his visible displeasure, obeyed. Sebastian turned to the integration team and said, "Let's get his car inside." It took 6 minutes to bring the hybrid into the technical bay through the vehicle access door at the back of the stage. The car moved through that space, with its dull paint, its aftermarket side mirrors, its windshield with the small chip in the lower left corner, and the contrast with the NovaDrive environment was so complete that 2 journalists who had followed to the edge of the access corridor stopped talking for a moment to take it in. Someone laughed, the short involuntary kind that escapes when something is absurd. Ryan heard it. He had heard that sound applied to this car before. He set his tool bag on the hood and opened it. The hybrid's hood came up to reveal something that stopped the 2 senior engineers closest to it mid-sentence. What they had expected, the generic layout of a mass-produced 12-year-old powertrain, was there, but altered. On the left side of the engine compartment, where a standard component would have been, sat Ryan's custom energy buffer, a compact assembly of capacitor bank, bus bars, and a microcontroller housed in an aluminum casing he had machined from stock in a rented workspace over 3 months. The wiring was color-coded and routed in tight, organized bundles, each labeled in small printed hand with abbreviations that the engineers, to their evident surprise, immediately recognized as standard power electronics notation. One of the integration engineers, Dr. Patricia Huang, who had a background in power systems and had spent 2 years at a national laboratory before joining NovaDrive, leaned in and looked at the capacitor bank for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, in a tone that had no performance in it at all, that the topology was elegant. Ryan said thank you without looking up from the coupling harness he was configuring. She asked about the controller firmware, and he named the specification he had built it from. She recognized it. She asked 2 more technical questions, and his answers were fast and precise. She straightened up, looked at Sebastian, and gave a small nod that meant this is real. Ryan connected the buffer's output harness to the auxiliary power feed at the junction box he had examined that morning. He ran a continuity check, verified the coupling, and pulled up the controller interface on a ruggedized tablet mounted to the inside of the hybrid's driver door, a device he had installed himself as a monitoring station. The readings came in. The oscillation was still present in the primary feed, pulsing at the interval he had first measured at 822. He configured the buffer's absorption parameters, setting the threshold slightly above the oscillation's peak amplitude so the device would absorb the spikes before they reached the vehicle, then set the output regulation to within 5 millivolts of the ND1's nominal input requirement. In the front of the demonstration bay, Sebastian had returned to the stage. He had made a decision he understood was either the most rational or the most reckless thing he had done as CEO, and rather than stand backstage in silence while Ryan worked, he had chosen to speak. He addressed the room without notes, without the tablet, with his jacket still buttoned. He said there had been a technical anomaly in the demonstration system, that his team had identified it, and that they were addressing it now. He said the ND-1 had performed exactly as designed. Its safety architecture had detected an external power irregularity and protected its core systems, which was the entire point of that architecture. He said he wanted to use the next few minutes to talk about something usually missing from launch presentations, failure modes, and what it actually meant to build a system you trusted. Companies most worth trusting, he said, were not the ones who claimed perfect outcomes, but the ones who had designed for imperfect ones. It was not the presentation he had prepared. It was better. Amelia, watching from the side of the stage, recognized what Sebastian was doing and recognized that it was working. The press corps had stopped murmuring. Several investors who had been checking their devices put them down. The live stream count, rather than declining, passed 1.2 million. Ryan's phone screen lit up on the workbench beside him. The name read, Ella. The video call icon pulsed 3 times and went still. He could not pick it up. His hands were inside the conduit junction, routing the buffer's stabilization output to the auxiliary rail. He looked at the screen for 1 second, at his daughter's name in white letters, and something settled in him that had been unsettled all morning. He went back to the connection. The buffer came online at the moment Ryan activated the controller sequence. For a long moment nothing changed. Then the oscillation data on his tablet began to flatten, the spike amplitude dropping with each successive cycle as the capacitor banks absorbed the excess energy and the controller's regulation loop closed in on the target. At 2 minutes and 40 seconds, the oscillation's peak dropped below the ND-1's battery management detection threshold. Ryan verified the reading twice. He looked at Patricia Huang, who nodded. Ryan walked to the edge of the technical bay and said, loudly enough to carry to the integration team lead, "It's ready." The ND-1's interior lights came on before anyone touched a control. The battery management system, sensing a clean and stable power environment for the first time since the feed had been compromised, began its reinitialization sequence automatically, a 37-second process that the cabin display documented in a vertical progress bar visible to the entire room. The progress bar reached 100%. The drive system engaged. The vehicle moved forward to the first marker with the smooth, unhurried precision of a machine doing exactly what it was built to do. It navigated the full demonstration path, 6 markers, 2 turns, 1 emergency stop, a reroute, and a final approach to the presentation circle without deviation. The room erupted. Sebastian stood on stage and let the sound happen around him for a moment before he spoke. Then he said, clearly enough for every camera in the room, the demonstration they had just watched was made possible by Ryan Miller, who had identified the fault that morning and who had come back twice to report it and been turned away twice, and whose ingenuity had just saved the event. He gestured toward the technical bay entrance, where Ryan had emerged and stood with his tool bag, squinting slightly in the stage lights like someone who had not expected to be seen. The first hour after the demonstration had the quality of a held breath finally released. The investors did not leave. The press did not leave. The story of what had occurred, the failure, the lockdown, the temporary employee with the modified hybrid, had already made it into the text chains and voice notes of every journalist in the room, and several were heading toward Ryan in the technical bay with the specific purposeful walk of people who have identified something worth reporting. Amelia found Ryan before the press did. She pulled him into a side corridor and showed him the log file she had pulled from the stage management system during the final minutes of the demonstration. The log showed the power feed parameters from 6 in the morning to the moment of the failure. In a standard preparation sequence, those parameters should have remained constant from the point of final sign-off, which had occurred at 11 the night before. Instead, the log showed a configuration change to the primary feed's output regulation settings at 2:14 in the morning, entered through an internal maintenance terminal using credentials issued to the facility's operations division. Ryan looked at the log timestamp and looked at the waveform data on his own analyzer, and the 2 sets of numbers aligned precisely. He said, quietly, that the modification had been deliberate. The change to the output regulation settings had introduced a synthetic oscillation, a periodic voltage variance just subtle enough to pass a standard inspection but calibrated precisely to exceed the ND-1's battery management threshold once the vehicle's full sensor array came online under demonstration conditions. Someone had known the vehicle's exact trigger parameters. Someone with access to the internal terminal and the specification sheets. Amelia had already been thinking about who. The terminal that logged the 214 access was in the operations corridor adjacent to Jackson Reed's office. The credentials it had used were from the facilities division, which reported to operations, which reported to Jackson. She had not yet said his name out loud, because the distance between a log entry and a conclusion required at least one more piece of evidence, and she was careful about conclusions. Jackson found them in the corridor less than 10 minutes later. He arrived already speaking, the way people do when they have prepared remarks for a situation they anticipated. He said the facility's power systems required a full audit, that the anomaly Ryan had identified was evidence of a maintenance failure to be escalated to the safety team, and that Ryan's use of uncertified equipment in a live event environment needed to be reviewed for compliance implications. He said this to Amelia in his capacity as CEO, in a tone that assumed authority over both the situation and the people in it. Ryan said that the oscillation he had documented first appeared at 8:22, which was 6 hours after the 214 configuration change logged on the operations corridor terminal. He said this in the same tone he had used all morning, even direct, without performance. He said the oscillation was not a maintenance failure but a synthetic waveform, and that its parameters matched the ND1's battery management specification sheets, which were not publicly available documents. He looked at Jackson and said nothing more. The silence in the corridor lasted approximately 5 seconds. It was the kind of silence that has weight. Jackson said that Ryan was making a serious accusation without the standing to make it. Ryan said he was describing data. Amelia said she had the log file and asked Jackson if he could explain the 214 entry. Jackson's expression held for a moment and then shifted, not dramatically, not into confession, but into the specific quality of stillness that comes when a person realizes the structure beneath them has moved. Sebastian appeared at the end of the corridor. Amelia showed him the log without preface. He read it in 45 seconds. He looked at Jackson. He said, "I need you to come with me." The conversation in Sebastian's office lasted 22 minutes. Jackson began with denials, moved through qualifications, and arrived at something close to the truth in the final 8 minutes, not full admission, but the kind of partial acknowledgement that becomes full admission when matched against documented evidence. He had believed, he said, that Sebastian would fail eventually with or without the modification. He had simply moved the timeline. He had believed NovaDrive needed different leadership. He had believed the board would agree after a visible public failure. Sebastian had security escort Jackson from the building that afternoon. He called the company's general counsel from his office and sent the log file, the configuration records, and his own account of the conversation. Then he went to find Ryan. Ryan was in the technical bay, disconnecting the buffer unit from the auxiliary feed and packing it back into the hybrid's engine compartment with the same methodical care he had used to deploy it. The NovaDrive engineers had mostly cleared out, and the hybrid sat under the fluorescent work lights looking exactly as unglamorous as it always had. Sebastian came in, dismissed the remaining technician, and stood next to the hybrid before speaking. He said he owed Ryan 2 apologies, one for the morning, when he had been too preoccupied to hear the warning Ryan had brought to his doorstep twice, and one for the broader context. The culture he had permitted at NovaDrive had made it easy for a temp maintenance worker to be dismissed without review when he raised a critical safety concern. He said both things plainly, without the hedging that apologies often contain when they come from people with power. Ryan accepted both with a nod and didn't amplify them. He said the important thing was that the vehicle had performed and nobody had gotten hurt. Sebastian said he had a question, and that Ryan was under no obligation to answer it one way or another. He asked whether Ryan would be interested in a permanent role at NovaDrive, specifically as the lead of a new energy safety verification team, a group mandated to review power architecture across all stages of vehicle development and event deployment, with the authority to halt any process presenting a safety concern, regardless of where in the organizational hierarchy that concern originated. Ryan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the buffer unit in the engine compartment, at the work of hundreds of evenings, the accumulated problem-solving of a man who had kept himself sharp by necessity, and then he looked at Sebastian. He said his daughter had a school recital at 6 and he had promised to be there. Sebastian said that was not an obstacle. Ryan said any role he took needed to allow him to be the primary parent for an 8-year-old, including school events, medical appointments, and the arbitrary unpredictability of childhood. Sebastian said he was asking Ryan to build a team, not perform a schedule, and that Novadrive's research facility had a family study room currently being used primarily as a storage space for old marketing materials, which he intended to change. The conversation was still ongoing when Amelia arrived with a small, self-possessed person in a plaid jacket who had been dropped off by her school carpool 45 minutes early because the driver had misread the pickup schedule. Ella Miller walked into the Novadrive technical bay with the calm interest of someone who finds new environments more exciting than intimidating. She looked at the ND1 parked at the far end of the space. She looked at the hybrid under the work lights. Then she looked at her father. She said the new car was very shiny. She said the old car was better though, because the old car had actually done something today. She had heard about it from Amelia on the drive over, and doing something was more important than being shiny. She delivered this in the tone of someone reporting a self-evident fact. The two remaining engineers in the bay laughed, not unkindly. Ryan crossed the floor and crouched down and held his daughter for a moment, and something in his posture was the same thing his posture had been all day, the same certainty, just aimed differently. He told Ella they needed to talk about something. She told him she already knew from Amelia that he had fixed a very expensive car with their old one, and that she thought he should ask for a raise. This produced genuine laughter from everyone in the room, including Sebastian Carter, who laughed with the unguarded ease of a man who had not laughed that way in several months. Ryan looked at Sebastian across the bay and said, "We'll figure out the details." Sebastian said, "Yes, we will." 3 months after the ND1 demonstration, Novadrive announced the formation of its Energy Safety and Systems Verification Division, with Ryan Miller as Director of Power Architecture Review. The announcement received a fraction of the coverage of the launch event, which was entirely appropriate. The structural work Ryan now led was designed by nature to prevent spectacle rather than create it. His team of 7 engineers operated under a mandate he had written himself, in plain language, on 2 pages, that no Novadrive vehicle or event system would advance to public demonstration without independent verification of its power architecture under simulated load conditions, and that any engineer at any level of the organization had the standing to halt a process if that verification was incomplete. It was not a glamorous mandate. It was a necessary one, and Ryan understood the difference between those two things better than most. The hybrid was not scrapped. Sebastian had proposed in the first week of Ryan's tenure that the vehicle be decommissioned and the energy buffer transferred to a permanent testing unit. Ryan had countered that the buffer was calibrated to the hybrid's specific electrical characteristics and that separating them would require rebuilding the calibration from scratch, which was true, though only part of his reason. Sebastian had recognized the other part without Ryan stating it and had signed off without discussion. The hybrid remained operational, registered to Ryan, and parked in Novadrive's reserved employee lot in the spot closest to the main entrance, which Sebastian had quietly designated for it in the second week. Nobody announced the designation. Nobody needed to. The ND1 completed full certification testing and entered limited fleet production 8 months after the launch event. The fleet contracts that had been uncertain on the morning of the demonstration were all signed. Jackson Reed's modification had been preserved in the case record exactly as Ryan and Amelia had documented it, and the legal process had proceeded with the patience and thoroughness such things require. Sebastian had given his statement and had said publicly no more than that Novadrive had identified a serious internal compliance failure and had addressed it. That restraint was also a form of leadership, though a quieter one than most people recognized. Ryan brought Ella to the Novadrive campus on a Saturday in the 5th month, when the family study room had been properly fitted out and Ella had decided she wanted to see where her father spent his days. She walked through the energy verification lab with the focused attention of a child who was genuinely interested rather than politely pretending to be. She asked several questions that Patricia Huang, now Ryan's senior engineer, answered with the respect one pays to a question asked sincerely. At the end of the tour, they stood in the main vehicle bay in front of the ND1 in its updated production configuration. Ella looked at the car for a long moment. She asked if her father was going to get a new car now that he worked somewhere nice. Ryan said maybe. One day. She considered this, then said the old car should stay, because it wasn't done yet. She said she could tell when something was done and when it wasn't. Ryan asked her how. She said it was done when it ran out of stories, and their car still had some left. There is a version of this story that ends with the technology, with the ND1 certified and in service, with the energy verification protocols in place, with the market outcomes confirmed. But the true end is this: sometimes the thing that saves the future is not the newest invention in the room. It is the person who was told their contributions didn't count, who showed up anyway, who brought what they had, and who held the line until the system remembered what it was for.
Holy shit. Adam, do you still have your first save? Yeah, I made it to the final boss, but I didn't win. No, I don't know if I still have it saved. Maybe. Oh, there we go. Made it. Is there a heal in here?
You don't want to set off that beast. In the backyard,
Oh, there it is.
Black Windgui's ally calls it
Welcome in, everybody.
Big Schutzer. Considering your strength,
Let's get to the next boss battle.
Get away while you can, little monkey.
Alright. Alright, I'll hit the dorky dork. Real quick. Rest. The most hyped up boss. Yet the easiest. You think the blue boss was, or this next one is? Didn't somebody say that the Pilgrim is the best armor in the game? If you fully upgrade it, is that true? Elden Ring movie? Nah, I haven't seen that. No, that'll be interesting though. This next